In the last section, we started talking about how we're going to take our Kubernetes cluster and eventually move it over to a production environment. We just spoke about some aspects of billing. I now want to give you just a quick couple notes on why we are making use of Google Cloud for deploying this Kubernetes application as opposed to AWS. Because after all, we did make use of AWS earlier on in this course, so it's a little bit strange to swap providers out halfway through in the context of a course. But again, we're doing this for a very good reason, so let me lay out a couple of reasons why we are swapping over to Google Cloud. All right, so here's my very quick checklist here. Now, before I talk about any of these points, I want you to just understand that these are my subjective opinions on why you might want to use Google Cloud for Kubernetes over AWS right now. These are entirely subjective, so people are completely free to disagree with me. No problem there. I don't mind if you disagree one bit. Totally fine if you do. So we're going to be making use of Google Cloud over AWS for these couple of reasons right here. First reason, Google created Kubernetes. They created the open source project and they supported the project financially for the first couple of years of its existence. That means to me that Google as an organization has a lot of experience with Kubernetes and they understand at a very low level why it works and what its purpose is. And so even though the people who created Kubernetes are probably not the same people who set up Kubernetes or all the infrastructure for it on Google Cloud, there's still a very good reason there to believe that there was at least a little bit of knowledge transfer. So essentially the people who set up Kubernetes on Google Cloud probably had access to some people with very low level knowledge of Kubernetes, and they probably understand very well how it works. Again, totally subjective. I could be totally wrong, but that's going to be kind of like, it's just my opinion. Now, the rest of the reasons on here are a little bit more objective than that one. So the next one, AWS only somewhat recently got Kubernetes support. That's in early 2018. Now, you might be watching this video in 2019, 2020, or even later, and maybe at some point in time, AWS will catch up with Google Cloud's implementation, but as it stands right now, the UI and the interface for manipulating Kubernetes clusters on AWS leaves a little bit to be wanted. Like, it's not that great, it's not that easy to use right now. So using Kubernetes from a UI perspective on Google Cloud, far easier, much easier, far easier to get started with because they've had a number of years to iterate on this product ahead of AWS. Next up, it is far easier to kind of mess around with Kubernetes far easier to mess around with Kubernetes on Google Cloud than it is on AWS. So in Google Cloud, we get something called a Cloud Console, which is essentially a terminal instance connected directly to your entire VPC of sorts hosted on Google Cloud. And so you get direct access to a kubectl command line tool that's wired up to your production Kubernetes instance. And we'll actually take a look at that in just a little bit. And so using this tool, you can very easily run all the same exact commands, like say kubectl get pods. You can run all these same commands in a production environment that we've been running locally. And on Google Cloud, that is extremely easy to set up and very easy to do. Now you can certainly set up the same system on AWS, but it's far more involved, much more involved. Really easy to get started just poking around with things on Google Cloud than it is on AWS. And then finally, in my opinion, again, these are some subjective elements here. In my opinion, the documentation around Kubernetes on Google Cloud is like light years ahead of the AWS documentation. Take my word for it. To a certain degree here, I am in the business of teaching people that stuff. I'm teaching you right now how to make use of Docker in Kubernetes. To a degree, I like to imagine that I've got a good understanding of what documentation is. And in my opinion, the Google Cloud documentation is just head and shoulders above the AWS documentation for Kubernetes right now. So take that for what you will. All right, so that's it. That's the 4 reasons that we're making use of Google Cloud for this stuff. I just wanted to be very clear about these reasons. I wouldn't normally kind of list these out or iterate them out. Except in this case, we made use of AWS earlier in the course, and so again, it is kind of strange to swap off to another cloud provider halfway through. But again, I really think that there is very good reason to do this swap off. Much easier to get started with Kubernetes on Google Cloud. All right, so enough of this. Let's take a quick pause right here, and we're going to get started in our next section with our production deployment by setting up a GitHub repository and pushing our code up to it. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.